So let's just shift now to tilth management. So the benefits of organics, of good soil structure are there. How do you build that tilth? How do you build the soil organics as a contribution factor to that tilth? That really depends on your soil type, your production goals, and your budget. If money is no object, I can turn a parking lot into the most productive soil in the region. For most of you, I'm going to assume that money is an option. And as an object of consideration, then we want to focus on things that are low or no cost to achieve those tilth improvements. So we'll just go through and discuss some of these tilth improvement options. Direct organic matter additions or indirect organic matter additions, retaining the organic matter that you already have, tilling smart and sparingly, avoiding soil compaction, and then inorganic additions, which also contribute to benefiting of tilth. Now with organic matter, it's good first to start with how much do you need? How much should you have? For central interior soils and temperate soils in general, most are very low in organic matter. Soils can range from less than a half percentage all the way up to 10% in soil organic matter, but it is more typical in their native state to be less than 1. So if you don't have a significant clay component to your soil, so by that I mean less than 30% clay, so you would be looking mostly at loams, sands, and silt soils. Our goal is really just to improve the overall percentage of organic matter that's there, because those organics are filling the space between the pores by those other soil particles. And I've come up with this scale as sort of a measuring stick that you can use to set targets and measure your own management against. So if you're under 1%, your soils are definitely challenged by low organics. 1 to 2, good. Better at 2 to 4, and really the best under practical considerations that we're going to achieve in the central interior is 4 and above. If you do have a significant clay component to your soil, so in which case we'd be looking at clay loams, sandy clays, silty clays, clays or heavy clays, then the absolute amount of organic matter isn't as important as its relative proportion to clay. That's because clay, being tightly bound and creating poor aggregates, is going to dominate your soil structure. And these guidelines I've adapted from Shepherd, recently published in the European Journal of Soil Science. So with greater than 30% component of clay to your soils, if you have less than 1 part organic matter to 13 parts clay, you are going to be challenged in your production. Ranging all the way up to greater than 1 part organic matter to 8 parts clay is probably the best we're going to expect to achieve under normal production practices in the central interior. There's a wide range of options for adding organics to the soil. They also range widely in the costs and have different practical considerations for individual operations to decide on what's best for them. So with direct additions, you can apply livestock manures, composts, biochar. Back in the day we used to call that charcoal. Peat moss, straw, deciduous leaves, sawdust, bark mulch, and wood chips. These organic sources, I put the caution that you should probably use them sparingly. I'll discuss that in a minute, because of their influence on the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil and pH. Because of the presence of the forest industry in the central interior, you might have access to pulp mill sludge or fly ash from some of the big burners. Both are suitable amendments to increase the organic matter, but you should use caution when you're applying these to your soils. And my principal concern is around the amount of heavy metal that you might be bringing along with those amendments. And then there's also opportunities in some locations to bring in sewage sludge or municipal biosolids from waste treatment facilities. And there, again, can be an appropriate amendment for increasing your organic matter, but you need to use extra caution when you're applying those as a means to increase your soil carbon. Things I do not recommend adding to your soil to boost the organic matter content. First would be night soil, which is the polite scientific terminology for untreated human waste. Any uncomposted animal tissues, so that would be specifically the non-specified risk materials, or uncomposted or composted specified risk materials. So that would be the brain and the spinal column of certain livestock, because they can carry prions which are not broken down in the composting process. You're at risk with those SRM materials of putting a disease vector out onto your fields for human and livestock health. It causes, as an example, mad cow disease or wasting of the brain tissues in other mammals. Should not use shavings or compost that are made from treated wood. And again, that's because some of the chemicals that are used in wood preservation treatments will survive the composting process. And anything that's mixed with garbage, inorganic wastes, so concrete, plastic, gyprock, rock wool, etc. Don't use these because all pose health or environmental hazards. So in adding organic matter to your soil, some things to consider. You really have to watch your carbon to nitrogen ratios. So carbon to nitrogen ratio naturally settles out at about 12 to 1. The microorganism in the soil will decompose the carbon down to that ratio for you. If you increase it by adding a lot of carbon all at once without corresponding amount of nitrogen, then you give the microorganisms in your soil a big food source, and they flourish and grow, and in doing so they immobilize the soil nitrogen, and that nitrogen therefore is not available for your crop. So it's a short-term phenomenon. They will bring the carbon nitrogen ratio back down to that roughly 12 to 1 ratio, but your crops are going to be starved for nitrogen in the interim. So for an example, if you're throwing raw wood into your soils, it has a carbon nitrogen ratio of 300 to 1 or more. So you really need to add a nitrogen source with that carbon source, or expect a lot of the soil nitrogen to be immobilized until the microorganisms break that carbon down. And watch what else is being added with your various organic matter sources. So what extra is coming along for the ride? So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and salts in manure mean that, especially because some of the livestock manures are fairly low in nitrogen, in order for you to fertilize your fields with manures, sometimes the tendency is to put extra manure on there to get the nitrogen level up, but that also means that you're putting a lot of excess phosphorus, potassium, and sodium in some cases onto those fields. That excess can leach out, so it becomes an environmental hazard. At very high levels, it can also become an impediment to crop production. If you're applying pulp sludge or fly ash as a soil amendment, you really have to be concerned with the amount of heavy metals that are arriving. Now legally, in order for you to be able to obtain and receive those amendments from the pulp mills or from a wood processing facility, you have to have a nutrient application plan prepared by a professional for you. What I've seen occasionally is that once the material arrives at the farm, that people don't necessarily always follow that amendment plan. So there are naturally occurring heavy metals in the environment, so lead, cadmium, arsenic, and they get pulled up into trees as a normal part of their growth. When you bring those trees in for processing, be it into pulp or the residues that are burnt and then end up as fly ash, that concentrates the heavy metal concentrations in those biosolid residues. And so by over applying, not following the guidelines of your organic amendment plan, you can toxify your soil with heavy metals. And primary concern I have with sewage sludge is also what extra is coming onto the farm and being put into your soil with that source. So, and often the problem with sewage or municipal wastes that are brought back and put onto agricultural fields is stuff that isn't tested for necessarily, but can survive the primary or secondary processing that goes into place on them. So there's all kinds of toxins or microplastics, some pharmaceuticals which do not break down. They're also not tested for and wouldn't be on any sort of amendment report that you would receive. So it's an unknown. Maybe you're getting it, maybe you're not, but it's just a risk there that you would probably avoid if you can. So in all cases, I recommend that you develop and follow a nutrient management plan when you're putting organics into your cropping area. And that what a nutrient management plan does is it looks at what's in the soil, what's in the amendment that you're going to apply, and what can the crop reasonably take up, so that we don't have great surpluses applied to the soil, and it balances things as best you can to the nutrition of the crop and what's going to be taken up the crop without having these excess reservoirs that can create health or environmental impacts.